two widows, one named Ruth, in a story from centuries before the time of Jesus, and one unnamed, observed by Jesus, whose voice is not heard. The women of the Bible can easily become caricatures of piety, as they are held to embody the essential lessons of loyalty, humility, and generosity, set up as role models to be emulated. But these well-known personal morality interpretations fail to heed the biblical critiques of the system that are at play in both of them. Ruth and the woman of the widow's mite story are well known, the topics of sermons that have left us feeling sure that we understand their theological purpose. But Ruth's loyalty and ingenuity in ensuring that the line of Naomi's family continues, and the unnamed woman's giving of her last coin as an example of worthy sacrifice, are interpretations that we might want to question. We might ask whose purposes these interpretations serve, and return to the stories with more inquisitive minds. What do the stories of Ruth and the widow's offering have in common? The main protagonist, obviously, in each story is a widow. In Ruth's story, in fact, there are three childless widows, Naomi and her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. And in the New Testament story, we may use our imaginations and wonder if the widow is also childless, as she appears to have no family to support her. In each story, wealthy, learned men appear. Ruth is taken as a wife by one of the great men of the city, and the marriage is formally approved by all those in authority and by the people at large. In the New Testament story, the scribes or learned men walk around in long robes and like to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and have the best seats at the banquet. But at the core of that description is a heavy criticism of their exploitative practices. They devour widows' houses. It seems that these well-reputed and pious men are appointed to oversee the affairs of widows, but instead use the widows' estates for their own gain. In both stories, the customs and rulings which govern people's lives are brought into question. Some scholars believe that the story of Ruth is a subtle piece of propaganda against the view that one's position in Israel was dependent on purity of bloodline. Sometimes you hear Christianity contrasted favourably with Judaism as a universal religion, not defined by race or nation. But we do an injustice to the Jews if we caricature their religion in this way. At the heart of the story of Ruth is the claim that the divine comes to us through the foreigner, the outsider. The theological ground of Ruth's story is God's fierce inclusiveness. The religious context in which it was written was the reforms of Ezra and Nehemiah, who had tried to purify Israel by casting out foreign wives and their children. In the characters of Ruth and Naomi, in a situation of grief and barrenness, God tears down some very carefully crafted security walls. Ruth the heroine is not Hebrew, but a Moabite widow who has been married to a Hebrew. Ruth speaks of the possibilities of the gifts which can come to us when we live beyond the walls that confine and divide us. Ruth stands in contrast to the voices that would expel the polluting, unwelcome aliens who seek purification of the nation. Her story suggests that an outsider could be an agent of God's radical possibility. Her story invites us to ask what would happen when walled worlds collapse. In the better-known first chapter of the book of Ruth, Ruth clings to her mother-in-law, ignoring Naomi's instructions and recalling for readers Genesis 2:24, a verse which is frequently used by religious conservatives to oppose same-sex marriage. It says, "Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." In Ruth's story, the woman and her daughter-in-law cling to each other, patriarchal family bonds are broken, and a new family is born. In hearing the story of Ruth, we learn that an alien woman is a distant ancestor of Jesus and a forerunner of what Jesus will ask the religious community to do, to cling to him by letting go of all that clings to them, including their ethnic, religious, and gendered presuppositions. The part of the story in today's reading about Ruth's trickery in obtaining Boaz's commitment to marriage is also worth attending to. The new refugee, who's Ruth, who the coalition government would obviously consider to be an economic migrant, connived with her mother-in-law to seduce an older, richer man, to claim him as a next of kin, even if he was only second in line. Perhaps to start gossip that he was sleeping with her, to put an obligation on him, to bathe, to perfume herself, to creep into the workers' accommodation while the man was a bit tipsy and exhausted, to crawl into bed with him. The story tells us that Naomi says to Ruth, do what he says, but it's actually Ruth that tells Boaz what to do. She seems to say to him, it's okay, put your blanket over me too, we're allowed to be together. Thinking about her agency and her risk-taking, I am reminded of the refugees of our time who refuse to accept the hopelessness of waiting passively for a grossly underfunded UNHCR to resettle them in a safe place. Facing famine and loss, Ruth did the equivalent of queue jumping. She pushed her way into a society that did not want her and asserted her right to a safe home place. She made a tough choice. So often the right choice is not what is expected. It is not what is convenient for others. It is taking a chance for life. Twice in the story, Ruth did the unexpected thing. Both times she claimed kinship and home. First to Naomi and later to Boaz. She did not just say, would you mind if I joined you? Where do I fill in the forms? I'll just wait here. She said, we will be family. I choose that we will live in this way. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God shall be my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. Ruth's reception in Israel might have been like that experienced by Muslim people in Australia today. People who are searched more vigorously in airport security lines, who have had their civil and human rights violated in the interests of national security, who are looked at with fear and suspicion by even more enlightened citizens. For a Moabite to set foot in Bethlehem would have set off all the cultural, social, and religious detectors of the time. There would be constant reminders that she is not one of us. There are many Australians who feel that Muslims from the Middle East are not one of us. The incarceration on Manus and Nauru of people fleeing persecution is only possible because these people have brown skins and because many of them are a different religion than the majority of Australians. I think it's also worth noting that quite clearly the modern state of Israel is also not hearing the message of Ruth in its appalling treatment of Palestinians. But in our criticism, we must always distinguish the state of Israel from the religion of Judaism. You only have to look at the movement of Jews of conscience to understand that there are many Jewish people who absolutely understand the teaching of Ruth, that through making a place for the outsider, as Boaz and the women of Bethlehem eventually did, we may find our own redemption. For the child born of Ruth and Boaz and Naomi was the grandfather of King David, ancestor of Jesus. I want to reflect for a moment on the New Testament story of the widow's offering, often cited during stewardship campaigns. She is held up as a model of generous giving. And while the Church Council and I are all for generous giving, the truth is that this interpretation also misses a radical critique of the system. The story of Ruth undermines the system of religious and racial purity. The widow's offering story undermines the temple system of Jesus' time. It's probable that donors at the temple treasury had to declare the amount of their gift to the priest in charge. Everything would have been visible and audible to the onlookers through the open door. And this was surely a means of pressuring a donor to give more than he or she could afford. Hisaku Kunakawa, a Japanese feminist scholar, concludes that Jesus criticised a system which is supported by, she says, is supported by those who are actually supposed to be supported by it. She believes that Jesus is not dealing with the issue of the quantity or measure of gifts. In her view, the widow is not a model to be imitated. Jesus rejects the temple system itself, and therefore, she says, no meaning is to be held in the amount of the offering at all. What irritates Jesus, she thinks, is the whole system of the hierarchically and patriarchally structured society. So Jesus responds to the scene of the woman's offering her 2 coins with the line, "I say to you, this poor woman put more than all the other contributors to the treasury, for they have all contributed from their surplus wealth, but she from her poverty has contributed all she had, her very livelihood." The usual reading of this remark renders the widow a hero, someone worth emulating, a selfless giver who gives until it hurts. However, this may not be what Jesus is getting at in the passage. We cannot read the story about the widow's offering without taking into account the few verses that precede the text that criticise the ostentation and exploitation of the scribes. Prior to witnessing the widow's offering, Jesus had been teaching his disciples about some systems of social inequity, of imbalance in the religious, political, and social structures of his day. This is not simply to contrast the wealthy with the poor, those who have a surplus of wealth from which they offer their gifts at the temple versus those who have only subsistence on which to draw. No, Jesus is painting a much starker picture that is in effect more about the wealthy scribes than it is about the poor, destitute widow. So if you think that this gospel passage is about the widow and about how honourable the poor are for being generous, you are missing the point. It's a story in 2 parts. In Act 1, we see the critique of the system, people who are covering up their exploitation of the poor by reciting prayers, and Jesus condemns it. And then we get to the 2nd act. Here Jesus and his disciples are hanging out across from that open door at the treasury. They see what's going on and who is offering what. And a poor woman comes and puts in a sum that represents all she has. This is not an opportunity to praise the widow, but a chance to lament the disgusting injustice that creates the condition of this scene. The widow's offering is an illustration of what Jesus was talking about. The religious, political, and social establishment has systematically corrupted her way of thinking, such that she apparently feels compelled to give far beyond what is sustainable. The real question that lies beneath this gospel is, what is the reason that someone who has nothing feels compelled to give from that lack to the temple? Who seeks to benefit from this exchange? We certainly know who stands to lose. A reading of Jesus' comments that appear to hold the widow up on a pedestal is, I believe, a perpetuation of this injustice inflicted on the widow in Jesus' time, an injustice that continues to affect the poor and the vulnerable in our day. It is a story that should be read alongside the article in this week's Sydney Morning Herald about the unfair burden that will be borne by poor Australians if GST is increased and expanded. I suggest you have a look at that article, with the headline read, "GST hike to hit poor hard and leave rich unscathed, research shows." GST is a regressive tax that requires the poor to give disproportionately more to fund the common good. And we are only talking about it because all the other tax reforms that might more fairly distribute our country's wealth have been deemed to be off the table by political and economic elites. What Jesus observed in his day remains true today, that those with the least continue to give more by percentage of their resources than the wealthy. It was wrong and unjust in Jesus' time, and he predicted that the system itself would fall. So in observing the woman's gift, Jesus is not endorsing this behaviour, but blatantly naming it for what it is and challenging us to see the structures that allow it to continue. What can we do to make society and our communities more equitable? Why do we let this continue to happen, such that the poor give until it hurts and the wealthy seem to so often benefit from the self-defeat of the impoverished? Finally, I'd like to compare that widow's offering to that of Ruth. The widow, Jesus said, has out of her poverty put in everything that she had, all that she had to live on. It literally translates as she has given her own life. And what did Ruth have to give? Travelling with Naomi from Moab to Israel, from the land of emptiness to the land of plenty, Ruth had apparently nothing to give, except her loyalty and her love. In seeking Boaz's protection and the redemption of Naomi's land, Ruth gives all that she has: her body, her potential as a bearer of a child, her future. We might say that she gives her whole life. And it's interesting to note in the story that shortly after this, Ruth disappears from her own story. Having presented her mother-in-law with a son, she is not mentioned again. Naomi nurses the child. The local women name him, and they even proclaim, "A son has been born to Naomi." Ruth, the ostensible heroine of the story, is left an enigma. Her continuing relationship to Naomi, her feelings for her son and her husband, her sense of belonging in Israel are never addressed. Thank you. Ruth's story is left now in our hands. She's disappeared from the biblical story, but we can find her and welcome her, include her, honour her and love her. And we will find her as we seek to find and love our neighbour who is Muslim. As we determinedly struggle without ceasing to bring Ruth and her children and her husband back from Manus Island and Nauru and embrace them as passionate risk-takers fleeing for their lives, people who will add much to the fabric of our society and to the fabric of our nation. And in the process of closing Manus and Nauru, we will free up vast amounts of money that will enable us to stop stinging the poor by hiking the GST. Detention on Nauru and Manus Island cost taxpayers more than $1 billion in the last financial year. Hisako Kinakawa suggests that the unnamed woman may have had a life-changing impact on Jesus. She says, yet as Jesus watches from the sidelines and sees the widow give her all, perhaps, although he can do nothing for her at the moment, she does something for him. Her presence may lead Jesus to accept his final collision with the powers that will determine his fate. In giving her whole life, she inspires Jesus to be the Jesus that we remember. A sense of mutual commitment is, in light of these stories, ultimately the source and mark of divine blessing for us and for our world. May her story and Ruth's story encourage and empower us to live with courage and compassion, with hospitality and generosity that is not just personal, but is transformational. May we make this world a home.